Welcome to a new series of the Dissidents Podcast with your co-hosts Jennifer Richmond and Brandy Shufutinsky. In this series, we explore the radical roots of liberated ethnic studies, how extreme ideology is infiltrating our schools, and the aim to indoctrinate instead of educate, and our search for solutions to empower parents, teachers, and students, giving them the tools to embrace inquiry and to express their individuality. Welcome back to our series of the Dissidents Podcast, where we're talking about the problems with liberated ethnic studies and general politicization. I can't say that every single time, Brandy. I'm going to have to say that over and over again. Politicization of the classroom with me, Jennifer Richmond, and my co-host, Brandy Shufutinsky. And today we have Mike Zhao. And just as a brief background for Mike. Mike is the president of the Asian American Education Coalition. He is also the author of the book, Critical Race Theory and Woke Culture, America's Dangerous Repeat of the Cultural Revolution. Did I get that right, Mike? I think I might have missed
China's Cultural Revolution.
Of China's Cultural Revolution. That's right. We're going to hear a little bit more about that. And what else? One of the reasons that we have Mike on is not only to talk about that, but Mike's organization is a part of the coalition that we have created, the Coalition for Empowered Education, where we are not only educating on some of the illiberal trends in our current K through 12 system, but also providing solutions. So in this episode, Mike, really would just love to hear from you. I know that obviously education is very important for you, and from what I know of you, there's a particular reason, because you have a background in the book that you wrote, Chinese Cultural Revolution, on Chinese Cultural Revolution. You lived it.
Yeah.
So let me just stop there and tell us your story, and then we'll jump in with some questions. But that's where we should start.
Sure. Basically, I am survivor of the Communist Chinese Cultural Revolution. So, I was born in 1963. My father used to be like a constructor, a construction manager. But, when I was 6 years old, he was labeled as, part of an anti-revolution group. He suffered political persecution, lost freedom, and also endured torture, and for also public humiliation, and for over 5 years. But this political persecution did not stop at him, because my grandparents used to be landlords. They were deprived the rights to continue living in the cities. They were forced to relocate to a poor mountain village. There was no tap water, no electricity, no nearby clinic. Just within a few months, my grandma suffered heart attack, and due to inadequate medical treatment, she passed away. Also, years later, my mom also passed away because this kind of extreme poverty, political persecution, so that kind of life I endured. And also, I want to share with your audience, during that time, China was dominated by class struggle, Marxist class struggle theory, pitting one group against other, right? Because that China was in extreme poverty. Everything was rationed, like rice, clothes, meat. Each urban citizen only had a 2-pound meat, about a kilo for the whole month. That kind of life I lived through. Fortunately, in 1978, another leader, Deng Xiaoping, took the power. The dictator Chairman Mao died, and then Deng Xiaoping wisely stopped class struggle, in China, implemented open and reform policy. So I had a chance to come to America, pursue my American dream. I received my MBA, also got a job at Westinghouse, later be acquired by Siemens, later become the director of global planning. I pretty much achieved my American dream. So because I lived through the two drastically different systems, so that's the reason I really love and cherish Americans' founding principle. I reject that kind of divisive, neo-Marxist or class struggle or like racial struggle theory, actually critical race theory. I call it, Karl Marx class struggle theory, basically Rev 2, basically second edition, right? 2.0, basically. That's the reason I get extremely concerned about this liberated ethnic study, which is very divisive.
First of all, thank you for speaking with us and also sharing your experience of surviving the Chinese Cultural Revolution and discussing what happened with your parents and your grandparents. I think it is difficult as it can be to share something like that. It's also really important for others to hear what they went through to understand where your concern's coming from. So what similarities do you think you're seeing as far as what you survived from the Cultural Revolution in Marxist communist China, and what you're seeing maybe in some of the schools, public schools, K-12 schools here in the US?
A couple, there are many things, but, in terms of the major related to the education, right? In general, I just mentioned a few in general things, like the censorship, the limit of the freedom of speech, right? That is one. And also most really damaging is really the critical race theory. It's very similar to Marxist class struggle theory, dividing innocent Americans into the oppressors and the oppressed, pitting one group against us. That's very damaging, right? So I tell you, I want to share with you one very hard lesson learned in China. When communists took over, and they, gradually engage indoctrination of children in Chinese schools, but they accelerated in 1962. They launched nationwide class struggle, education, basically, instigate hatred between the people, right? They label the landlords as oppressors, and label the peasants as oppressed, right? Pitting one group against other. Under this kind of indoctrination, just within 4 years, Chairman Mao was able to indoctrinate tens of millions innocent youth, later become Red Guards, who, tortured millions of people, even murdered them, right? And they destroy all China's cultural heritage. That kind of devastating effect. So I'm concerned in America, we teach our children, try to, pitting one group against other, try to draw a line using the race and label like white or others as oppressors, and then say, people of color are oppressed, right? Historically, that was true. But after the civil rights movement, all the law has been changed. And in many of them in favor of minorities, they still claim there is a systemic racism in America. I don't think it's true. So do not treat everyone equally, pitting one group against other, launch the racial struggle, in America. That is most damaging, and I worry about that if we allow this kind of liberated ethnic study going on, maybe in a decades. We're going to train a lot of radical social justice warriors. They may destroy America.
I as a student also of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, I did not live through it, thankfully, but studied it. One of the things that really strikes me is you talk about the class struggle, but as part of the class struggle too, there was this struggle you saw during the Cultural Revolution, particularly during the height with the Red Guard era, of students and youth turning against their parents even, and that kind of class struggle. And one of the things that this isn't specific to liberated ethnic studies per se, but I think when we see like some of the politicization of the classroom, a lot of the parents don't know what's going on in the classroom, and they're not being informed. And so sometimes you wonder if it's not almost by design that it's like that, where we've started to see instances, I'm having problems speaking today, of kids railing against their parents. Usually what I've seen with regards to not class struggle but racialization is I've seen this several times with kids who have mixed race and have parents of two different backgrounds. And so that also I've seen it playing out not only in the classroom, but it's also playing out at home. And so I think this radicalization that we're seeing has implications for both the classroom, but also just how we operate in society as well. Is that something that you have noticed?
Absolutely. Actually, I document in my book, right? Basically, when the China launched the a nationwide class struggle education, communist-controlled magazine called People's Education, they published one article glorify the love to its class, right? It says your love of your mom, your dad, and your between the siblings, between brothers, sisters, are not as important as the love to your the comrade in your same class, right? So that is very damaging. So they impose the ideological driven, that kind of moral value, and then impose, set as higher priority. You guess what? During Cultural Revolution, there's many cases like the parents, the children reported the authority about their parents. There's one famous person whose name called Zhang Hongbin. He reported because his mother said something bad about Chairman Mao. He reported that, and then you guess what? Next day, his mother was sentenced to death without a trial. This kind of thing happening, and a husband reported the wife reported the husband. In America, similar thing happened. One lady, like a white girl, she put her parents' dialogue into the YouTube, try to embarrass her parents because her parents say something conservative. Also, in one company, actually, the CEO fired her. His daughter said something politically incorrect. So that is something, very similar. So that's the reason I said America. Actually, I was the first as early as June 2020, I already called it, America's dangerous repeat of China's Cultural Revolution.
So how do you make a distinction? Because I'm a very strong believer in free speech, and we have this fine line when we talk about free speech and hate speech. How would you make the distinction between free speech and things being politically incorrect versus politically correct and acceptable to say, and then and also crossing the line over into hate speech? Because I mean, I have an idea, an opinion on it, where I am firmly against compelled speech, especially in schools. And I think it's really easy to get kids used to compelled speech. So whether that's a land acknowledgement or a pronoun declaration or anything else, I think it's really easy to normalize compelled speech and that idea. But how do you make the distinction between politically correct speech, polite speech, and hate speech?
I think there's two dimensions here. One is make distinction, right? If something illegal, right, absolutely instigate like racial hate, hatred, that kind of things we should ban. Also instigate violence, right? That kind of speech absolutely we should ban. But if a speech is just different perspective, even speech just point out like some like weakness in different culture. I don't think that is not is kind of hate speech. Today even comedian cannot make a joke about a different people's habit. That's just as dangerous as Chinese Cultural Revolution, right? Everything need to be political correct. You guess what? During Cultural Revolution, they compete. There was one famous actress. She played a lady who who was against landlords. You know what? More radical red guards when during Cultural Revolution. They said they blame her. This lady called Huang Wanqiu, a famous musical called Liu Sanjie. But when they use more ultra revolution standard to measure, even the lady played a role against landlords, that was not good enough. She was basically lost freedom for 10 years. She suffered political persecution. So if you compete for the ultra pure that kind of ideology, everybody suffers, right? So that's I answer first distinction. Another is degree of punishment. People, especially teenagers, right? They sometimes say something incorrect. Even a word, maybe we can say it's racist words, but one or two words, you want to give them a chance to really correct, give a chance to rethinking, to apologize, but currently, if you say something incorrect, you've been canceled, you lose your job, you lose your opportunity to go to the college. That is too much. That is our country actually so-called DEI inclusion become intolerant. That is a problem. So I think our country, we absolutely should emphasize love, but we, should not really, punish people for some, just misspoken or have different viewpoints. Severe especially.
So not related, again, specifically to liberated ethnic studies, but to the pedagogy behind it, pedagogy of the oppressed. One of the things that I've noticed, and with in particular, my Chinese friends, is this sense that merit has been on the chopping block, and that this idea of merit is damaging and I was going to say un-American, but it's actually very American. But this is where I see a lot of the Chinese Americans in particular pushing back around some of the ideology that is entering into our education space, to the extent that even at times Chinese Americans and Asian Americans in general are often coined the inconvenient minority. Can you talk about your ideas and your worries about where we're going with regards to this idea of merit and the particular impact of this ideology on, I know it's a generalization, but on Asian Americans in general?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, I want to share with your audience, really the meritocracy started in China about 1,000 years ago in Sui Dynasty. That time we all have called 科举制度, means emperor examination. We started first pioneer select the government officials by standardized test, is by the pretty much unified test, right? So in this case, we can eliminate any kind of favoritism, right? So that was a very good tradition being adopted by all civilized society. So when we come to America, we found affirmative action use race, right, to treat people differently, applicants differently. Also, many radical left organizations, started canceling the standardized tests in University of California today. Over 1,800 colleges, make the standardized test optional. They also canceled the admission, test for Thomas Jefferson, or number one in science technology high school in the nation. Also Boston exam schools, and also like lower high school in San Francisco. Fortunately, it was restored. So they are like also, they even label, learning math as racist. That is totally insane. Without math, how can we maintain our technology leadership in the world? How can we protect our nation, right? So that's the reason, since 2014, I have been, mobilizing Asian Americans, supporting my organization, Asian American Coalition for Education, supporting the lawsuits against Harvard, against the race-based affirmative action. We're very happy the U.S. Supreme Court, we basically defend, help us, protect our equal treatment. So they struck down the affirmative action in June. So we're extremely happy on that. So, so we want to really defend American meritocracy, because it's also, that is the bedrock of the American dream. American dream says, each U.S. citizen should have equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work, determination, and initiative. That means equal opportunities. That means meritocracy. So that's the reason, we actually, especially Chinese Americans, are up front, really fighting, to defend meritocracy in America.
I think there's a bit of a false narrative on the idea of meritocracy only being something that the Asian American community values. I think that there are many Americans, I know there are many Black Americans who value meritocracy and have actually been fighting for decades to be judged on our merit, not on our race or color or culture. And I think that it does a bit of a disservice to not actually recognize that was the whole movement for civil rights, is to be judged on our merit. And the idea that we have to eliminate meritocracy, to me is a racist idea at its core, because it's saying that certain people are not good enough. They don't have enough merit to make it. So we're going to eliminate the standard. I mean, I think that's, at the core of a lot of racism.
Right. That's the bigotry of low expectations.
Yes.
You're exactly right. Actually, Dr. Martin Luther King, right? He's famous, I have a dream, right? He said, I don't want my 4 little children be judged by the color of skin, but by their content character, right? So
and
actually,
he was hated for saying that. Yes.
And also, I want to share with you some data, right? According to Pew Research Center, right? Since 2019, they did a very scientific survey. 2019, overall 73% Americans and supported our view. Also, last year was 74. This year jumped to 82. Even Black, 62% in 2019, and 59% in last year, 71% this year, all support college admission should not use race, right? So, and also you are very correct. Like one of the leaders who has been leading the fight against affirmative action, Walter Colony. He is Black, civil rights leader, right? So, we have actually all the majority of Americans all support our views. We don't want really race-based college admission. We really, love and cherish the meritocracy.
That part that we haven't, I think, touched on quite enough is a little bit about liberated ethnic studies and the point of view that they're bringing to. I think it's actually important to discuss the histories and cultures of all people that make up the fabric of the United States. I don't think that we should ignore historical, cultural, and experiential differences. I think it's something to acknowledge and learn about and celebrate. I think that's going to improve intercultural communication and understanding. But my disagreement is the way certain people are going about it, where it's very divisive and it actually isn't going to improve those relationships. It's damaging them. I wonder what you think about how to kind of strike that balance to where we're able to, for example, how we started this discussion, you're able to tell us and all of our listeners about the experience you had surviving the Cultural Revolution in China, what happened with your father, what happened with your grandparents and your mom. And I think if we didn't have that, we'd be more ignorant. It's great to be able to learn from each other and in each other's experiences. I'm wondering what you think that balance is in learning about our differences and being and fueling division because of our differences.
Yeah, I guess, we first should respect our history, right? And then historically, actually, there was like white supremacy, there was systemic racism against Black, against like Native Indian, against Chinese, the famous Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So many things people of color suffer. But in the meantime, we need to really look at the progress America has made, right? We have we abolished the slavery system, a century ago. Civil War, the hundreds of thousands of white soldiers, including white soldiers, also Black, right, died for the equal treatment, basically. And also like civil rights movement, also it abolished, I think, all the laws that are discriminating against people of color. So we need to see the progress. And today, we need to recognize individually may still have some kind of like discrimination, but this country called it has systemic racism. There's no data support that. That is untrue. If we say this country is kind of dominated by white privilege, white Asian Americans, not white, are the highest income, best educated racial group in America, right? So that's so-called inconvenient minority. So and also if we look at things, we need to take a really more balanced view in terms of individual achievement. The radical left, this kind of liberated ethnic study, the one common mistake they tend to make is they tie everyone's unsuccess go all the way back to the government, to the political system. But in reality, even we have perfect system, if you have individual do not want to make efforts, or you have made the wrong decision, don't have good behaviors, you will fail, right? So, I think all ethnic study, number one, we should recognize historic, mistake America made, also recognize a huge progress. If say we are still systematically, country with systematic racism, why so many people of color, waiting in line in the embassy of American embassy in Africa, in Asia, in all the continent with people of color want to migrate to here, right? Immigrant to here. So that's totally untrue. So we want to recognize our progress. And also, when talk about individuals underperformance, we need to really look at the two sides. Whether or not we still have policy, not treat them fairly, or we already have policy, but maybe in some individual behavior, individual decision making cause their, their failure. So that's something we want to be, in a balanced way. That is my suggestion.
Yeah, I think, Brandy, we haven't talked about this yet specifically, but Mike really hit on a point about the individualism. And I think that's one of the biggest damages of liberated ethnic studies and the pedagogy that we see filtering through other courses as well, is grouping us up, into identities on immutable characteristics, and allowing, us to expect this kind of government to come in and correct this, versus really looking within and seeing how we can improve ourselves. And so I think that external view of self-improvement ultimately is another way that we're going to see a generation of kids not taking responsibility for how they operate in the world.
I think that a lot of times there's that tension because you get extremes. Either everything is someone else's fault or everything is the individual's fault. And I think that there isn't enough of a balance. But I don't think that any one individual can, become a success and achieve everything just out of individual fortitude. I think there's a lot of other things that go into it. But I think that it's out of balance. You have one side that wants to just blame the system, and you have another side that wants to just blame the individual, and not seeing that they both should, individual and the system work in concert with one another. At least they should. Right now, it seems maybe it's working against, they're working against each other instead of working together.
Or caught in that binary either or, we can't,
So, the reason, one of the reasons I'm against this liberated like ethnic study, say want the children, the students to have developed critical consciousness, to see the hidden system oppression, right? So they always try to really blame the system, try to find the something to hate, right? Say, okay, I'm being unfairly treated. That is not correct. We should really look at both angles, right? So, some individual policy, I believe, could be discriminatory. That could be. We should not lose sight of that. But everything blame the system, blame the policy is totally irresponsible.
Yeah, I agree.
And we're not teaching, that's one of the problems too, is we're not teaching that nuance and complexity. We're teaching kids what to think and how to think, and so it's lacking that nuance and complexity and that critical thinking where you can get beyond the either or paradigm that we seem to be living in, to appreciate nuance, complexity, and celebrate difference even.
Yeah, and also another thing is really like in terms of teaching children like utopia, that kind of ideology is totally like dangerous, right? So we need to really teach our children have more like a good way to evaluate the policy. Example, communism, right? If we look at the policy, we should not only look at the purpose or stated purpose of that policy. Communism, its stated purpose is helping all the poor, okay, liberalize all the poor people all over the country. But when we look at the policy, we need to also look at the results. Actually, communism, either starved to death or murdered, or hundreds of millions of people all over the world, right? So, many things, it's not to say you want to guarantee us again good results from government. Actually, you cannot. Communism is this kind of collectivism, that kind of ideology, try to guarantee, the results for everybody. End of the day, everybody suffering the poverty. And people really fight, struggle against each other, murder each other. So that's dangerous. So, one very, thing I'm against of the liberated ethnic study is really inside the hate. We should not really inside this kind of hatred between racial group, we should not dividing the line between the racial group. We should really dividing the line between what is civilized, what is like backward, what is civilized, what is good practice, what is bad practice. If we recognize each racial group, each culture has some strengths and weakness, we learn from each other, learn the good things, abandon, reject the bad things. I want to say, all the racial groups in America, Black, Hispanic, and Asian, all will make good progress by doing that. Instead, just simply label, one group is oppressed or another group is oppressed. So that is the wrong approach.
Mike, thank you, as Brandy said already, for sharing your story. I mean, it's fascinating. And I think that it's one that we see coming up, particularly from other Chinese Americans who have had a direct experience with the Cultural Revolution and are seeing, like you said in your book, this dangerous repeat of the Cultural Revolution as you also said, Cultural Revolution 2.0.
Yeah.
This brings up, and I'll just make this last point. I think it's maybe it's easier to repeat something when we haven't learned about it or from it, and maybe that's really a push, or maybe it should be a motivating factor that American students need to actually learn more about, as you mentioned, Mike, what communism actually resulted in. The deaths of hundreds of millions of people. And maybe that would make it just a little bit more difficult for Marxism to be making its way into our K-12 education system.
Well, and that goes to something you and I've talked about before. Instead of these ethnic studies and these classes that are studies, let's teach more history, whether that's Black history, Asian American history, world history. I mean, I do think that's what's so shocking to me as a China scholar, and I'm sure this, Mike, you feel the same as someone who's lived through the Cultural Revolution. It's been glorified, like it's been erased in a way that we don't remember what happened, and that's why it's getting repeated, because we're actually not teaching. We're doing the opposite. We're revolutionizing.
Exactly. Actually, we have not really done enough to expose the evil of Marxism, right? Actually, his theory led to more deaths than Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany murdered millions of people, right? That is a horrible crime. But actually, communism under Karl Marx theory actually murdered, probably 10 times or more, hundreds times, more people than, Nazi Germany. That kind of effect we need to be aware. Both are evil, that's my point.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much. Thanks for speaking with us and taking the time to share with everyone your opinions and your expertise and your experience surviving, not just surviving the Cultural Revolution in China, but also everything that you've done since you've come to this country and all of the work that you've done. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for having me.